So we've finished up 1st and 2nd Samuel. And if you remember, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, all one big scroll, right? So we really didn't actually finish it. So we're just into part 2, which is Kings. Now, a lot of people tend to think that 1 Samuel's about Saul, kind of, but we do see the rise of David in 1 Samuel, and then 2 Samuel's about David, and 1 King would be about Solomon, and 2 Kings is about all the other kings. I think that that's kind of a simplistic way of looking at these books. If you have your outlines, I gave them to you, and you'll notice that I outlined it in 3 ways. Like in 1 Kings, you've got chapters 1 through 11, and that is about Solomon. But really, what did I write here? It's also a focus on Jerusalem and the construction of the temple. And this is really important for the whole biblical story, right? And the reason that that's important is when we look at what I outlined as point 3, the southern kingdom through its captivity, that also focuses on Jerusalem, but it's going to focus on its destruction and its exile into Babylon. Now, if you've been with me since Genesis, you'll remember I told you the Bible's the tale of 2 cities, Jerusalem and Babylon. When we were in Eden, Eden was kind of like the original Jerusalem, and the wilderness, everything outside of Eden, is Babylon. And as we continue through the Bible, there's always this tension between the city of God and the worldly city. You know, the city of God being Jerusalem and the worldly city being Babylon. Here in Kings, we're going to see that tension play out in real form. We see a literal Jerusalem, which is where the United Kingdom is. And, of course, the Assyrians are going to attack in 2 Kings. They're going to destroy the northern kingdom, which we'll get to. And eventually they'll send the Judah into exile as well. And they'll go into exile into Babylon. And so the way this Bible story has worked is we're in Genesis. We've got this perfect creation. God wants to be with his creation. Man mucks it up. God kicks man out of Eden into the wilderness, and God issues a whole bunch of promises. Hey, I'm going to make things right. Of course, man continues to get wicked. God floods the earth, meets Abraham, a bunch more promises, a little bit of slavery in Egypt. God starts rescuing people. He starts to fulfill these promises. We've seen this. God starts to make himself known to his people, through the law. And it's kind of interesting, like a side point on the law that I was thinking about when I was putting some of this together. We see some rules like, do not murder. And we think that's a nice moral law. But have we ever thought, why would God give us the law, do not murder? The whole Bible has this theme that we should have faith in God. And so everything is ultimately going to tell us to have faith in God, right? And so even the law, as he's given it to the Israelites, whether it's the ceremonial law or the moral law, is all about faith. And so we see this thing of do not murder. And so, yeah, morally that's good. Like, don't kill people, I can get on board with that. But why would God command that? And the first thing we get is, well, people are made in God's image. Okay, well, God sent the flood and he killed a whole bunch of people made in his image. Next, why would God say do not murder? Well, it's real simple. We have to have faith that God's going to take care of things, right? We don't take the law into our own hands. If somebody does me a wrong, I don't kill them. I trust that ultimate justice will come from God. Now, whether that person ends up in heaven or not my call. I just trust that ultimate justice will come from God. It's not my place to take the law into my hands. And that's why God gives these laws to the Israelites. He's trying to teach them to be faithful. Now, of course, we've seen right off the get-go, they're in the presence of God and they're making golden calves, and they're not very faithful. And so through a series of fun, wacky adventures, they finally end up in Israel. Through Joshua, the conquest, and all this stuff. And we get into the Judges where, remember, we had the sin spend cycle. So God has fulfilled their promises, and we even talked through Ruth, where God's in the background setting things up for even more future promises. And the Israelites, through all of this, they're stuck in this sin spend cycle, just spiraling down. The Judges ends with, there was no king of Israel, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And so we pick up from Judges into the last judge, which was Samuel, and we get into Israel getting their kings. And as far as the historical story is going to go, really kind of at the end of 2 Kings, the historical narrative kind of ends. We'll have a little bit with Ezra, but we're going to kind of end, for the most part, our historical stuff as far as what the Bible has to tell us, especially with once the second temple's built. However, there's, sorry, let me collect my thoughts, make sure I say this right. When the Israelites have come into Israel, they're actually not going to be there very long, for about 20 generations of kings or so. And we're going to see that the sin spend cycle, they just make a mess of that, and they're going to get booted to Babylon, right? God's going to have a future plan. And in fact, we talked about the revealing of the big future plan in 2 Samuel chapter 7, the Messianic promises. That was last week. So we have this whole overarching story going, that even with the faith of the law, the temple, and we're going to see that the first temple is going to be built. God's going to have a house, not that he needs a house made by human hands. This doesn't do anything to rectify the sin problem, right? The sin spend cycle will always go out of control, and to the point that God just says, get out of my land. And we know it's his land because we saw that in Deuteronomy chapter 32. And so, there is going to be a corrective punishments and all this stuff. People will eventually get brought back so that Jesus can come on board. But that's going to be kind of the high-level overview of how this all ties together. Now, there's a lot that happens in 1st and 2nd Kings, and especially it's going to set up a lot for the Old Testament. We're going to look at Solomon and how he relates to David, what he does, and really, we might actually understand that one of the keys about the Bible is we see all these people, and anybody that goes to Sunday school or grew up in Sunday school, we're taught the heroes of the faith. In fact, this is in Hebrews, right? Like David is a hero of the faith, Moses is a hero of the faith, Solomon, all these people. But when you really read their stories, you notice that they're just horrible, horrible people. And that's because the Bible is not about them. The Bible's about God and what he's doing for these horrible people. They just happen to be horrible people with good faith. And that's supposed to be the encouragement to us, right? Not that I get on the whole total depravity bandwagon, but we are far from perfect. God alone is perfect. And we can see these pillars of faith for who they are. They're not untouchable. They're not so great that they're not human. They're very much human. And in fact, as we get into Solomon, with 1 Kings, we see that David is sitting there with his son Solomon, and this is in like chapters 1 to 2. And the first thing he tells Solomon, and he sounds like Moses. He really does. He's just like, Solomon, I'm old, I'm dying. I've got like a young lady next to me. By the way, no hanky-panky going on. All biblical scholars agree on that. Or 99%. Nobody agrees on anything. But anyhow, David's like, I'm old, I'm dying. He's going to sound just like Moses. He's going to say, stay faithful to God. And Solomon's like, yes. And then if David would have shut up, that would have been perfect. But does he? No, he goes, oh, yeah, and get revenge. Kill everybody. Just go on a murdering spree. I need you to just start just assassinating people. Okay, good start for Solomon's kingship. And here many people think Solomon's a great king. And he did a lot. Don't get me wrong. I'm not bashing on him. He maintained a united kingdom, and he would, even once we get to the Psalms, we'll see that leaders are put there by God for a reason. But Solomon was just, he teaches us because he is allowed any gift he wants. He could have been stronger than Samson, but he's like, no, I want wisdom. And was wisdom enough for to be perfect for salvation? No. Solomon goes off the deep end. He basically breaks every kingly rule in Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy 17, Moses tells everybody, don't get a king. You don't want a king. You have God as your king. If you get a king, your king is going to tax you. He's going to build up armies. He's going to enslave you. He's going to have so many wives. And God doesn't want so many wives. He wants one wife. He's going to do all these things wrong. And, of course, we see a little bit with Saul and we see a little bit with David. But, man, when Solomon comes on the scene, and this is kind of around, this is in chapters 9 through 11. In 5 through 8, Solomon's going to build the temple, Solomon's temple, the first temple. And it just goes into a lot of detail. Just kind of when Moses built the tabernacle, we get all the blueprints and, so all this ornate gold and flowery image. It's meant to represent Eden, right? That's the whole point of God's dwelling place. Because remember, in Eden, heaven was on earth and God was with humans. After sin, the two separated, and it's only through, the atonement by blood that God can kind of interact with humans. And he does that in the altar inside the tabernacle. Well, they're going to build a permanent one, the Holy of Holies. Now, of course, through Jesus, we all become, in this sense, that's what we mean when we say we are the temple, or what the Bible means when it says we are the temple. God indwells in us on earth, just like, there's a little bit of heaven on earth in each of us, if you want to think of it that way. Maybe a little bit not 100% correct, but it's a good way to start thinking about it. And so anyhow, Solomon's going to build the first temple. It's no longer Moses' tent. But as soon as he does that, even with all of his wisdom, he marries Gentiles, hundreds of them. He's going to adopt other gods, and he's going to introduce their worship into Israel. They have their own land. They know the stories of Joshua and Moses and the Exodus and, the defeating of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is the big enemy. Up until this point in the Bible, make no mistake, Satan is not the enemy of the Old Testament. Pharaoh is the boogeyman. This portion of the Bible takes us to about 500 BC. When Israelites want to scare their little children, they didn't tell about the boogeyman under the bed. They told them about Pharaoh. And Pharaoh scared them. He was the bad man. And we want to keep that in the back of our mind because, ironically, Solomon is actually very much compared to Pharaoh by the writer. He, in essence, becomes Pharaoh by the end of his reign. So, in fact, he resembles Pharaoh even more than David did at the end of his reign. And so that kind of shows us the sin-spin cycle, even with these great kings. David, a man after God's own heart, one human leader cannot direct a full nation, right? They're responsible for that, and we're going to see this with the prophets' introduction in the center of Kings. But I'm trying to think of another good way of saying it. Even with these human kings, they cannot do what God was doing for them. It's probably the best way of saying that. And so we're going to get to chapter 2, or part 2, which it's kind of I call it the divided kingdom, and that's 1 Kings chapter 12 through 2 Kings chapter 17. It's a huge portion, and it's really kind of broken up into three areas. And the writing of this really is going to help us with the rest of the Old Testament. Because like I said, what we're going to have for historical stuff after this is we're going to have a little bit with Ezra and Jeremiah with rebuilding the wall and building the second temple. And we're also going to have Chronicles, which First and Second Chronicles is basically David's fanboy trying to soften up history on David. It's a priestly view of what happened in Samuel. But other than that, we're kind of done with the history of Israel. And the rest of the Old Testament is going to take place within all this time frame that we've covered through these books. And so this portion of Kings is going to help us understand a lot of the prophets, the major and the minor prophets. The major prophets being the really long books like Isaiah and Ezekiel, the minor prophets being the really short books like Habakkuk that nobody ever reads. Great book, by the way. So anyhow, as we get into the split of the kingdom in chapter 12 of 1 Kings, Israel's going to split in two. So Solomon, he's done. His son Rehoboam, who basically resembles Solomon at the end of his reign. A lot of people think Rehoboam's this like evil little snot, but the author's really trying to make us see like he kind of resembles Solomon. He's just slightly worse. He is greedy. He is power hungry. He makes some horrible statements as far as taxation goes. But he is resembling Solomon when Solomon was at the end of his reign. And that's part of that sin-spend cycle. And he basically wants to increase taxes for slave labor. And so, this other guy, Jeroboam, he's going to rebel, and this is going to create two kingdoms. And so we've got the northern kingdom that's going to consist of basically 10 tribes, and they're going to call themselves Israel. And then we have the southern kingdom. It's going to have Judah and Benjamin, and they're going to call themselves Judah. And they're located in Jerusalem. And which is important because, as we heard in Genesis, the scepter will not depart from Judah. So we've now got these two kingdoms. They're split up in chapters 12 through 16. And what's kind of interesting is Jeroboam, when he goes up north, where it's not going to, eventually Samaria will become the capital of the northern kingdom, but not just yet. Jeroboam, he's going to build two temples, one at Bethel and one at Dan, to compete with Solomon's temple. And he puts two gold calves outside. This isn't a coincidence. Jeroboam is directly calling back to Exodus 32, with the calves at the golden calf at Mount Sinai. But he is saying that these golden calves do reflect Yahweh God. It's very confusing, but you have to understand that Solomon has at this point brought in other pagan gods into their culture. And so there's like this mixing of what they understand the Israelite God to be. So with this, and that's why God didn't want people to mix all these other cultures in. So when Jeroboam puts these calves out, he's like, yeah, these are Yahweh. Well, anybody that actually read it would be like, no, God doesn't want golden calves to represent him. In fact, the second commandment says, do not make like likenesses of God or idols, right? But they are in such a sin-spend cycle that he's like, oh, here's golden calves that represent Yahweh. I'm going to put them outside my temple. And people kind of miss that point that the golden calves by Jeroboam represent God, not a pagan god. This is how messed up the Israelites have become at this point in their thinking. And so what we're going to have is the author of Kings. He's going to basically, as we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam as our first two kings of the northern and southern kingdom, he's going to rate the kings. Are they a good king or a bad king? And he does this based on three criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone? That's the first criteria. Did they rid Israel or Judah of idolatry? That's the second criteria. And the third, were they faithful to the covenants like David was? And that's why David was such a good king. That's why everybody's compared to David. Yeah, he messed up horribly by killing his best friend Uriah and committing adultery with Bathsheba and all that stuff. But David was always faithful to the covenants given to Abraham, the covenants given to Noah, the covenants given at Mount Sinai with Moses. David was very faithful to those covenants. And so all the kings are going to be compared to on these three criteria. The northern kings, there's like 20 of them. None of the kings meet these criteria. In fact, they all fail. Some come close. We all say that they're bad kings, but some actually come close. They'll meet like 2 out of 3 of the criteria. But they're still rated as a bad king because they don't make 3 out of 3. In the southern kingdom, we get some good kings. We get 8, actually, 8 out of 20. And that's because they meet all 3 criteria, but we'll still notice that they're not the best kings. And then we get to one of my favorite areas. It's in 2 Kings. It's let me make sure I read that right. 1 Kings 17 through 2 Kings chapter 8. This is the kings and the prophets, right? And we really haven't dealt with prophets so much in the Bible. Yeah, we had Moses, great prophet. But prophets haven't been a thing. And we're going to have, like I said, we're going to have the major and the minor prophets coming up next. And Kings is meant to introduce us to an idea of the prophets. And Kings does this with 2 northern prophets, Elijah and Elisha. And these 2 prophets, they didn't write any books that we know of, or they may have, but they're not in our Bible. But they are put in Kings specifically so that we can understand that, like, you know, when Hezekiah was king, he had Isaiah as his prophet. Like, this is where we get the authority that the prophets belong in the Old Testament, is the inclusion of these 2 prophets. And kind of the other amazing thing is a lot of people think that the Bible is just filled with miracles, but it's really not. There's sections of miracles. The very beginning, in like the first 2 chapters of Genesis, whole lot of miracles going on, like the creation of just everything. So that's a pretty big miracle. And then the miracles, I mean, there's a few little scattered here and there, but they kind of die out, right? Like, you know, yeah, sure, Sarah's like 99 years old and she gives birth. That's a miracle, but that's like a one-off miracle. That's just not that. It's not like a bunch of miracles. Moses shows up. There's a lot of miracles there. So, that's the first time that we see a person being acted on as like a miracle doer, where God's acting through them. Like, so there's a whole lot of miracles in that section with Moses. And then, if you notice, like with Joshua, sure, there was a couple miracles. Like, he walked around a wall and it fell down, but not a whole lot of miracles going on. Kings, sure, there were a couple, like Samson's super strong or something, but, you know, not really any miracles. Ruth, no miracle at all. Miracles just kind of like how we live today. There may be 1 or 2 miracles here or there, but they're just rare. You know, miracles are meant to point to God, and at this point, God is just, he's not really pointing to himself. Sure, the ark goes into battle and people win, or, you know, the ark defeats you know, the Philistines. You know, there's a couple small miracles going on, but nothing big. But when Elisha and Elisha shows up, we've got floating axes, we've got dead people coming to life, we've got the firestorm versus the 400 prophets of Baal. We have a lot of miracles going on. Like, this is one of the biggest miracle sections. The only miracle section that gets bigger is the Gospels, when Jesus shows up. Because it's going to be kind of quiet. The prophets will do 1 or 2 miracles here or there to show that they're a prophet of God. But for the most part, the miracles kind of die off again until Jesus shows up on the scene. And I think it's kind of interesting that with Elijah, you know, he's like this desert wild man, right? And he's kind of the contemporary of Ahab and Jezebel, and, you know, they're God's Baal. And there's just a lot of fun stuff to read. I mean, I could spend days talking about that. And he battles them, and it's one of my favorite areas to go to when people are telling me that, like, I need to be nice to, outside believers, because sometimes I'm not the nicest. They're like, well, you got to show the fruits of the spirits. And I'm like, well, Elijah didn't, because he's sitting there battling these prophets of Baal who are insulting his God. And he's like, so where's your God at? Is he sleeping? Maybe he had to go pee. Go get him. He's peeing. Like, he is purposely insulting these people. So, yes, it's in the Bible. We can insult people to insult our gods. Just playing, but don't follow my advice on that one. But what we do see, and this is what's kind of interesting, Elijah does like 7 major acts of authority or miracles, right? And then we get Elisha, who shows up, and he asks for double the authority. And guess how many miracles he performs? 14. The author is very intentional about this to show that this works out. And then we get into the southern kingdom, which what I call chapter 3. And again, it focuses on Jerusalem and the destruction of Israel and their exile to Babylon. So the northern kingdom, they're going to get attacked by Syria, and they're going to go into what's called dysphoria. They're going to get dispersed, pretty much kind of forever. Now, a lot of people say that they're the lost tribes. That's not true. If you don't believe me, read James. He writes the letter to the 10 tribes in dysphoria. So, obviously, by the time of James, they knew where all the tribes were, or to the 12 tribes. No, the tribes were never lost. That's kind of a myth. But the southern kingdom, they're going to last a little bit longer because they have a couple of better kings. But eventually, Babylon's going to come in, and they're going to take out the southern kingdom, and they're going to go into 70 years of exile. 70 years is very specific because they were breaking the Sabbath law for like over 400 years, and they had to let the land rest for 70 years to make up for all the years that they broke it. Basically, you can't cheat God out of what's his. He will always get what's his. And and it focuses on the destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple. And that's going to, like, I wanted to try to get all of these in together. That way we can kind of keep moving on. Plus, I also we've got 7 minutes. I was asked a question at the end that's a little bit different that I wanted to tie in. So that's kind of the high-level overview of what's going on in 1st and 2nd Kings. But I was asked, like, why did Jesus show up when he showed up? Seems like this might be a good time for Jesus to show up. Israel's about ready to lose their land, right? And it's interesting when you look at the timing of Jesus when he chose to show up. Like, if he showed up today and was walking on water, turning water into wine, and people were videotaping it with their iPhones, putting it on YouTube, would anybody believe it? No, skepticism's too hard. Photoshop. Yeah, seems like God kind of knew the future and knew that there was a right time to show up. Because everybody's like, well, it's no, the skeptics can be like, well, funny, Jesus showed up before photography. Oh, you mean when people could edit photos and do fakes? Yeah, kind of like he did that on purpose, maybe. Now, why didn't he show up earlier? And I actually looked into this question. So it's the alphabet, believe it or not. So initially when people did writing, they used these huge clay tablets, and they would stamp like pictograms into them. They were big and heavy, and they also broke. They were clay. You drop it, it breaks. Think of Moses on Mount Sinai. I don't know if anybody's ever seen History of the World with Mel Brooks. It's a comedy. Moses comes out with 3 tablets, and he's like, I hold in my hands these 15, and one falls, these 10 commandments. Clay tablets break. So, and eventually they get to cuneiform. And now, about the time of Moses, as Moses is coming up, maybe some people argue Joshua when Joshua is second to Pharaoh, but Moses, we have archaeological evidence of what's called the Proto-Sinaitic script. It's basically a very early form of Hebrew. In fact, if you can read Hebrew, you can somewhat read the Proto-Sinaitic script. Now, here's a problem with this early alphabet. It would have still been put on clay tablets. I'm going to use English. I've got two letters, and I want you to tell me which word I'm writing. ST. What's my word? Not a very clear message. That's how Hebrew used to be written. There was no vowels. Could be sit, it could be sat, it could be set, it could be, seat with two E's. We don't know because there's no vowels. Now, once the Masoretic Hebrew language came out, which is around the time of Daniel, they started putting those little dots that you see underneath the Hebrew, which actually indicates a vowel form. But more importantly, what we're going to see is a few other developments. First off, Cyrus and Darius, which are mentioned by Isaiah, they're going to invent something really neat. It's called the post office. That's an invention that we're going to need. But this post office only works for the government. That's how governments are. They're kind of selfish. So military correspondence, government official letters, because papyrus was actually invented by the Egyptians around the time of Moses. They'd take reeds and they'd lay them together. It was very expensive, but you could write on it. But there's no way to send these letters around. They just kind of stayed local until, Cyrus and Darius invented the post office. But only the government used this. Nobody thought of doing something different until the Greeks. Now, what we need is every country had their own way of doing things. Every country hated each other. Every country spoke a different language. So even with the invention of the alphabet using vowels, instead of pictograms, which would, trying to write out the Bible in pictograms would have taken like 1 million clay tablets. So good luck mailing that one out. But even with these nations, the letters would have never left the nations because the post offices, like this Darius and them invented, only worked within their nations. So now you need the Roman government to come in and unify everybody. Well, and in order for letters to travel all throughout, you're going to need good roads. So you're going to need these roads. Now, of course, for letters to travel safely on the roads, you're going to need what's called the Pax Romana, the time of peace in Rome, which actually lasted from I think 46 BC to 100-something AD. Very, very small window that we start to get to. And during this time, they actually contracted the mail, and civilians could send mail to civilians. Notice how, with the advent of technology, we start to get things that we're going to need for the Bible. And, things like being able to write on paper, being able to write a concise message shortly. Instead of lots of pictograms that would take 1 million clay tablets, I can write it using an alphabet on one scroll. And now I can send this scroll through the mail, and I can send it safely because I have a road system, and I can send it to a different nation, say I'm in Jerusalem and I want to send it to Antioch. Or I'm in Antioch and I need to write the church in Corinth because they're messing up again. Right? I need good roads. I need safe roads. I need a unified kingdom. I need everybody to speak the same language, Greek. I need paper. I need an alphabet. I need a time of peace. I need all these things in order for the message of the gospel to proliferate. We are talking about a 60-year window by the time all these things come into effect. By the way, Jesus was born within that 60-year window. So when people ask, why did Jesus show up when he did? Those conditions have never been met ever since then. That was the only time in human history that it was possible for Jesus to show up and his message proliferate in a way that it could. Yeah, of course, today I have the internet. I could write, I saw Jesus walk on water. Skepticism. Do you have photographic proof? Yes, I do. Oh, you altered that. You used AI. Nobody's going to believe it. Back then, the testimony of witnesses, all this stuff played a huge factor. And that allowed the message to go out the way it did. Had Jesus shown up at any other time, the probability of that message going out, because without post office, Pax Romana, everybody speaking the same language of Koine Greek, it would have gone nowhere. So when people wonder, why didn't Jesus show up here during the decline of the kings or in Judges? Well, sure, he could have done all of his stuff to Israel, and they might have believed. It would have never left Israel, and nobody would have ever heard of him. So hopefully that answers that question, and that also concludes 1st and 2nd Kings, which concludes the book of Kings. Any questions?